When scheduling out this review for exactly 1 year since my review of the first Golden Sun, I actually managed to create for myself a gap that is very close to the amount of time that actually existed between these two releases. And while this gap of only 17 months seems borderline insane in this day and age of 6 to 8 year development cycles, this was absolutely the plan of Camelot all along. There is, of course, heavy reuse of assets, mechanics, and the like, but there's also a mechanism built directly into the first game in order to transfer your data between games, either via code or link cable. And as such, I got to start my journey with this sequel by entering the world's longest password manually, since trying to emulate a link cable connection seemed like more trouble than it was probably worth. A lot of people will say you don't really need the full-length gold password, and you probably don't because it doesn't give you a ton more of import versus the shorter password, but I felt the need to trudge through that 15 minutes of password entry regardless for the full experience. Even though you don't really start getting things for doing this until you get pretty deep into the game, it's a lot of fun when it does finally start happening, resulting in special dialogue and extensive references to the last game, alongside some extra items and that sort of thing. Even within the first few hours of the game, it's immediately clear that in a lot of ways, this game feels like a continuation of the first, basically directly. And that's not just because of the transfer. Very early on, you get the ship that lets you travel the world, something that often marks the late game of a JRPG, as if you're starting this game already in the late game. In a lot of ways, this honestly feels like the second half of a much larger JRPG, and even if it takes 40 hours or so to wrap everything up, it feels like a smaller part of a much longer game. Unfortunately, a lot of that open world also isn't very well signposted, meaning that it can be very difficult to figure out what you need to do next. Now, this wasn't particularly uncommon in games of this style at the time, but I just want to make it absolutely clear that a lot of these games really intended you to play with some sort of reference book by you. More than likely, they would have wanted you to buy the guide that they had licensed, but a normal walkthrough off GameFAQs will do. So, in no way should you feel bad for making use of a walkthrough or even occasional search engine usage in order to figure out what you need to do next. Ultimately, it's kind of a neat idea to split up a game into two parts released 17 months apart. Borderline episodic when it comes to the usual video game release cycle. But it also means that unfortunately the most important thing that needs to be said about Golden Sun: The Lost Age is just how damn similar it is to the first game. I really liked that game, and while its sequel is a ton of fun, it's also painfully similar in a ton of ways. It plays almost identically, so if you're not really engaged in the story or down for more of the combat, you might be really disappointed in what's on offer here. In fact, I'm gonna barely touch on basic mechanics here, and you should feel free to reference my review of the first game, because they're all but identical, with new spells, Jin, and character classes just kinda slapped on top. For me personally, though, while I certainly felt pretty disappointed and disheartened in the first hour or so, as soon as they started introducing some new stuff, I was fully back in. Overall, I found what got added pretty sufficient. Things like the new synergy that mixes up the navigation and puzzles is just enough in that department, and the expected loads of new Jin and gear help out over there. Now, if they had continued down this road, making slight changes over and over with new releases out into infinity, I could see it growing tired, but just this one sequel feels okay to me at least. Now, I'm sure it'll be interesting for me to eventually find out how I feel about the third game and how similar that one might be, but until then, I'm pretty happy with this pair as mostly same, but just different enough to not make me feel bad about spending another 40 hours. Moreover, the Lost Age plot is actually more interesting than the first games, because the new perspective that you get with the new characters that are the primary focus of the game actually give you new insights into a lot of what was happening in the first game, but from a different viewpoint. Now, is that plot still incredibly simplistic and predictable? Absolutely. But just like the first game, it remains a fun enough ride to keep you engaged for the entire time. And to be sure, the things the first game was great at with its storytelling are still things the second game is great at. In terms of stuff like set pieces and storytelling mechanisms, the series can stand right alongside the absolute best of the 2D JRPGs that had preceded it, even if it doesn't nail its actual primary plot. And there are certainly some set pieces to be found within the story that really amp it up in this game. The developers are making the absolute most of the GBA hardware by this point. There are some truly great moments that really take you aback, especially after you've been sitting through a lot of, frankly, milquetoast stuff. When those top-tier moments really hit and tie in with the game's fantastic soundtrack, at least for a few moments, everything fully clicks together, and that really helped continue to drive me forward in this game. Now, just like the first game, the usual JRPG bugbears are still very much present, however. Random battles happen way too often in places you'll have no trouble finishing a fight. Getting from town to town in the overworld can be a pain until pretty late in the game. Dungeons are often hellish mazes. Arok deserves a really disdainful special call out here for being an absolute special, terrible hell. The list goes on. But while your average RPG player these days may not be used to those, at the time they unfortunately would have been taken basically as just part of the genre. Though we were definitely getting to the end of that era by this point in history. Today, Golden Sun harkens back to the SNES RPG era in a way that was only happening on the GBA by this point. But I think whether or not you're going to enjoy this game very much comes down to liking the first game. There is basically zero reason to play this game if you haven't played the first, because while it does make accommodations for players who do not transfer in any save data by placing extra gin around and giving you pre-made versions of the first game's characters when they finally do join your party, a recommendation as to whether you should play The Lost Age or not kinda comes down to a very simple question. Did you like the original Golden Sun? If you did, as far as I'm concerned, The Lost Age knows where to ramp things up and make them interesting again, and where to ramp things down. And the combat, while still tedious, is the same level of tedious that it was in the first game. If you came away from the original enjoying it, and none of the things I've talked about this second game turn you off, you owe it to yourself to check out its sequel, if for no other reason than to wrap up the story while having a pretty good time getting there.